Hello and welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Andrew O'Hare, Executive Editor of Salon. Joining me today is author David Duchovny, whose new novel is Miss Subways. Some of you may not know this, but apparently, David, you also have worked in television. Is this true?
I have. I've worked in television and film a little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Just for about 25, 30 years now. Nothing to speak of, really.
So I hear, of course I'm joking, David is a two-time Golden Globe Award winner, longtime star of The X-Files, star of the, lamented Californication show I very much enjoyed. And you're also a writer, director, producer, I think.
Sure.
You've dabbled in that as well. But this is not your first novel, and in a certain way, one could argue that maybe at a certain point in your life, it was likelier that you would end up as a literary novelist and
Sure.
maybe a teacher
Yep.
of writing or literature than a
Well, that was the
well-known actor.
plan. That was
Yeah.
the plan. I was in graduate school. I was working towards getting a PhD, so that I envisioned teaching at a college level and
Sure.
getting college level vacations, which are like 3 months, 4 months a year,
Yeah.
in which I would write.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the long range plan that I was looking at in my early 20s.
Yeah, but both of my parents were English professors, so I think we could have a long conversation about how interesting.
Yeah.
That-
What you do with your summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we went on long road trips,
Right.
all over the place. I saw every Civil War battlefield as a kid, teenager.
It's a wonderful job. Aside from teacher being a wonderful vocation, I mean, it is a good job in that way. You do get quite a bit of time to yourself, or to raise your family, or to do your own work.
What was your field like? What were you going to get a PhD in specifically?
English literature.
Yeah.
I was writing on the name of my thesis, which you had to come up with a thesis title.
Sure.
And for your orals. So when I sat my orals, I went through my hour and a half of grilling on the history of English literature, and then they ask you, pro forma, they ask you, what is your dissertation on? And mine was on magic and technology in contemporary American fiction and poetry, which might lead you to believe that I would then get a job working as an actor on The X-Files, which just made perfect sense.
It does fit together in a certain way, and it also feeds into Miss Subways, I would say.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Well,
a little
actually,
bit.
like the idea of my thesis, which was never written,
Right.
I might have written a chapter, I don't remember, but I was discussing certain authors. I was discussing Robertson Davies, who's a Canadian author, James Merrill, poet, Thomas Pynchon, Ishmael Reed,
Yep.
and maybe Norman Mailer, I think. So I was discussing these, and I was saying that my theory, or the topic, was that magic is a primitive technology, in the sense that magic makes shit happen.
Right.
You know, that, like, if you took a caveman and you showed him an airplane, he'd be like, magic.
Of course.
And
yeah.
we'd say, no,
Yeah.
technology. So as magic, it's a field of both good and bad magic.
Right,
There's
right.
black magic, white magic. Technology, we don't say good and bad technology. We have
Yeah.
we have an A bomb, we have an H bomb.
Yeah.
We know that they're dangerous, but we don't say bad.
Right.
So to discuss
Interesting,
technology in terms of magic, which
Right.
is what I said that these writers were doing, they were kind of trying to ascribe a moral field,
A moral dimension.
a magical moral field onto technology.
And isn't this actually a major point of discussion in the technology world now? Like how much to think
I
about
was ahead of my
morality?
time.
You
I
were
wish
way ahead of
I
your
wish
time.
I'd written
Yeah.
it. I wish I'd written it. I blew it.
Yeah, and look how you ended up. It's been terrible, right?
Well, yeah, well, I mean, you look at somebody like Oppenheimer, where you have
Yeah.
somebody dealing with this issue, which is, and
Now
the
the
truth is,
physicists have known sin or whatever it was. he
right,
said,
well, the
yeah.
truth is that, and sin obviously being a moral
Yes.
valence, but we've never had a technology that we haven't used. Like,
Right, that's
the
right.
scary thing is like, if we can do it, we're going to try it out.
Right.
So
Right.
to try to imbue technology with a moral field is I think, a worthwhile enterprise.
Yeah, if it's possible to use social media by flooding it with nonsense in order to completely pervert the democratic process, somebody might try to do it.
Right,
Just
exactly.
Just to cite a random example. But there's a lot of stuff in Miss. Now that you've explained all that, there's a lot of stuff in Miss Subways that kind of comes.
I hadn't even. I thank you for bringing that up, because I really haven't put it together myself. So it's good to know that I finally have written my thesis in a fictional form.
In the form of a very entertaining, funny, and I thought consistently surprising novel. Just on the first few pages, I could tell that I was I was actually today reading this on the subway, which is kind of the perfect meta level, probably. And it is about the Miss, it does refer at least to the Miss Subway's pageant, a famous part of New York's past, which we can get to. But in the first couple of pages, you have a joke about Paul Manafort and explanations about the man-spreading phenomenon on the New York subway, which was a big thing, still is a big thing, kind of. And references to George Eliot, one of my favorite subway reading authors, actually. Strangely, she writes in fairly short, pithy paragraphs.
Was she serialized? Is that why?
So maybe. Nietzsche, who you don't mention, is also really good for the subway because he writes those tiny little epigrams.
Nietzsche comes at the end. And it's not short, though. It's one of the longer ones.
One of the longer ones,
It's a beautiful piece of Nietzsche. But yeah, anybody who writes parabolically like that, like Nietzsche or Jesus. Or,
Jesus is good too.
I love me a parable. 12-step programs, they all they're good with slogans and sayings.
I don't necessarily believe, however, that they actually had a quote from Kafka's Metamorphosis on the wall.
I think they might have. I know.
Which also occurs in like page 5 or something like that.
Well, that's the first one. That kind of sets the whole train running. But I really do think that was the inspiration. One of the inspirations for the book was sitting on the subway and seeing that. That's what I tell myself. I think I did see that quote in the subways.
Wow. Which does seem fabulously misguided to have something about a guy turning into a giant cockroach.
I know, on the subway.
Where you are likely to see a giant cockroach at almost any moment.
You're likely to see a human-sized cockroach at any time.
This is true. So tell our viewers/readers a little bit more about this book and the genesis for it. It does refer to Miss Subways. It is set in New York. It is partly about the subway system, but not just that.
Well, it uses the subway system metaphorically as an underground, mythologically as a place where things are hidden, a place where things lie fallow, a place where maybe your power is lying dormant as opposed to up top, above ground. So it kind of uses that. It also uses the subway as this magical connector of human beings, of where it takes a human from one place to another and it randomly might intersect them.
And you observe that the social rules on the subway are kind of different from daylight.
People act, I think they act worse on the subway than they might. I think they feel like they can't be seen so well.
Right.
At least that's always been my experience as a writer. But there are many like inspirational strands for the book, but I think the overarching kind of world that I try to create is to conceive of America. It is an immigrant nation, and that as all these waves of immigrants came from all the countries of the world over the past few hundred years, they brought with them their gods, their customs, their mythologies, and as they assimilated, for better or for worse, more or less, some cultures have assimilated more than others. Some remain somewhat standoffish, but that these mythologies and these gods have remained, and yet they're kind of bored and angry that they've been thrown under the bus for Jehovah or the Judeo-Christian God. And they still have their certain amount of power, and they still have games to play, and they still have their mythological power to flex. So they're still around, and in this book there's Filipino, Irish, Chinese, African, Haitian. There's all different kinds of different mythologies from our melting pot of a nation that are still here. So that's kind of the world that exists in the book.
It might be fair to say, and I actually don't see any clear relationship, but I couldn't help thinking of Neil Gaiman's American Gods in reading this, and it might be fair to say that people who enjoyed that universe might also.
Well, I have to say that was a scary thing, because when I was writing it, I think I told somebody, maybe I had even written a draft, and I told somebody basically what I told you.
Yeah.
And they said, "Well, have you read American Gods?" And I was like, "No." And I was like, "Shit." So then I went and I read it, and I was like, "Oh, thank goodness, it's a completely different,
very different
conception.
story." Yes, yes.
And then I even went beyond that. There was actually there were ideas floating out there that even precede Neil Gaiman's execution of this particular idea of other gods, being on this soil. So I was like, okay, it's kind of an idea in the public domain. They're good, so. And
to get back to the literary scholarship, I don't know. We don't want to sort of give people homework because I promise.
Nobody wants homework.
There is no homework required to read this book. It's very enjoyable on its own terms. But I know that there's a famous in its time, not famous now, verse play by William Butler Yeats, the possibly
Sounds like homework to me.
maybe greatest poet ever, one of them anyway, makes the short list.
Yeah.
That played a role here, but explain exactly how that works. What's that play about? What grabbed you about it?
Well, when I was in graduate school at Yale, a friend said, "Come out and see. I've got a friend who's performing in a play." I said, "Okay." And then I sit down, and it's a verse play, and you know, verse play. It's a different time and a place. It's a different pace. Let's say it's a different time and a pace.
That's fair.
It's like watching a poem on its feet.
Right.
It's not exciting. And not a lot happens. It's about the language. So you're watching language, and I'm falling asleep. And but I stayed awake long enough to understand what the terms of the play were, which was, it was about the Irish king Cuchulainn, or Cuchulainn, I think, and Emer, his wife. And Cuchulainn has, in a frenzy, because he's found out he's murdered his own son in battle, is now fighting the waves, which he's going to lose, because you don't beat the waves.
Famous metaphor, You
don't beat the waves. So a demon of some kind called a Beyond Seed comes, banshee we say in English, comes to omens of death, comes to Emer and says, "This is what's going down with your husband. You can save him, but if you save him, he will not know you. He'll wake up in a concubine's bed. He won't know that he had children. He won't have any idea that you ever existed, and you can't ever know him again." So she has to give up her hope of an old age with this man in order to save his life. So that stuck with me. That was like 1980, probably 1984, 1985. And it's always been in my mind that, like, I would like to see a fucking ballsy pagan rom-com like that. You know, our rom-coms are so toothless and weak. You know, oh, I had to give up coffee, and now we love one another. You know, it's like, so it's like, here's like really, this is a rom-com with meat. And I thought, well, like, I would like to write a rom-com like that. Like, this is my version of a romantic novel with, like, true pagan stakes of nasty life and death.
So you kind of have this element of pagan mythology or spirituality even. You have a relatively realistic contemporary setting. And you have this kind of literary device that's almost science fiction-y, the like sliding doors alternate universe kind of thing, where there are forks we can take in our lives that create.
Well, depending on her response to the wager, which the demon gives her, she can choose to live her life as it has been and he dies, or she gets a different, slightly different life minus him. And that's the second part of the book. And then the third part, and it's also about a woman kind of developing her own agency as a person and as a writer. So when we meet her, and if it's the sliding doors business, when we meet her, she's more of this man's assistant, more helping him, propping him up. When he disappears from her life, she becomes more of the writer of this story. And in the third iteration, she is truly the owner of her own story.
It takes probably a certain amount of courage in this era for a guy, which is how I perceive you, to write a story where for the most part, a female protagonist, female narrator at points, is very much oriented to her consciousness. Did you feel like you had to sort of reality check yourself or get outside input in order to get that right, or did you just rely on instinct?
I just relied on instinct. I think as an actor and as somebody who has written screenplay, teleplay, I've had to write female characters. So when I did that, I didn't shy away and go, oh my God, who am I to try to write a female character? No, there's women in my work, and I'm going to write it. I believe. I know that people talk about appropriation, and I do a lot of appropriating in this book, not just of female voice, but of other mythologies. So, I mean, I'm of the school that what appropriation really is imaginative empathy. It's like I'm trying to write as a woman, I'm trying to make these stories serve my own story. I'm not saying this is how women think. I'm not saying
Right.
I'm better at being a woman than a woman is. I'm not saying this is how these mythologies should have gone. This is a better rewriting of the actual mythology. I'm just merely mixing everything together and making a new story that's not in any way authoritative of anything else except as an exercise in imaginative empathy, I think.
Well, I think it, you know, I wouldn't know how a female reader receives this, but I never felt like it was either patronizing or trying too hard, if you know what I mean. The two pitfalls that you see there, that you were trying to think through this person,
right.
you know, who has flaws and virtues.
Well, it's
and all the
it's
rest
a
of it.
voice. When I write, I kind of write to a voice. In the first book, it was a cow, a female cow. You know.
This is true. This is true. Your first book. Yeah.
I certainly appropriated that, but in the second one, it was the voice of the son of Ted, and in this one, it's Emer, and so I'll write until I can hear that voice, and then that's when the novel really starts for me. So it's less about sex, male-female sex,
right.
and more about a voice, and I think it's a human voice before it's a male or a female voice. And I think that that's why I hope it's recognizably human before it's recognizably female or male.
You absolutely don't shy away from kind of contemporary political references in here. Nobody is going to read this book and conclude, for example, that you're sweet on the current president. Although it doesn't exactly play a role, but there's enough sort of oblique. I said that Paul Manafort is mentioned on approximately the third or fourth page. And I heard that you actually had to decided to take out stuff about Bill O'Reilly. I read that in a previous interview with you. That were you trying to strike that balance between I want this to feel contemporary and I don't want it to be so that if somebody reads it 6 months from now, it feels outdated?
Well, yeah. I mean, what happened was I had a discussion between, I think it was Emer and her dad, or no, it was Emer and Khan, her boyfriend. Because he himself is kind of making himself a kind of right-wing, he wants to be a kind of a right-wing spokesperson. And he is saying at one point that I cut out, I was like, do you think Bill O'Reilly is really the asshole that he portrays himself to be? No, he's playing a part. And Emer says, no, I actually think he's an asshole. And then this stuff happened, and then it was like, well, I can't do it. It's just, you know, the real news eclipsed whatever point I was trying to make between these two characters, and it wasn't structurally important to the book, so I could just kind of excise it easily. But I think there's a danger, you know, anytime you name check stuff that's happening in the news. But again, it was very important, and I think one of the reasons I set out to write in the first place was it was during the Trump stuff with the wall. And it was Trump. It was Trump saying, you know, protect America from these immigrants. And in many ways, the first iteration of the idea of this idea of immigrant ideas coming into America is of a guy going, keep them out. It's Kahn's version of it saying, no, the American stuff is better. The Judeo-Christian heritage, what we've created here in America, is strong. We got to keep it safe and pure. And by the end, when Emer controls the story, it's let them all in and let the best ideas fight. Let the strongest ideas fight, and the best ideas, like animals have, you know, Darwinian evolution and survival of the fittest, so will ideas. And it's way more inclusive. So, you know, not that you can build a wall to keep out ideas, although that's what they're trying to do.
They would like to. Some people would like to do that. Absolutely. Yeah. I want to. We should wrap pretty soon. Unfortunately, I'd love to keep talking to you, but I want to ask you about the title really quickly. This book is very much. I know you grew up in New York. You still live here at least part of the time. Is that right?
Most of the time.
Yeah, most of the time. And the title refers to, and I guess you could call it a beauty pageant of sorts that existed in the city's past, Miss Subways. But especially for readers who aren't familiar with this aspect of New York history, what was Miss Subways and what role does it play in this story?
Well, when I was a kid, and the advertisements in the subway were cardboard, and we used
Yeah.
to steal them quite a lot.
You were one of those
Peter
kids.
Max was a big one that you wanted to get.
Yeah, sure.
Especially off the back of a bus. But yes, we stole a lot of this stuff. Anyway, I guess it's all electronic now, obviously, but it used to be just like a cardboard, and they'd post it in there. And Miss Subways was, I don't know if you call it a beauty pageant, because they weren't really judged.
Right, not a pageant exactly.
Yeah,
I guess.
I don't know. It was a contest.
Right.
And the contestants had to, I think I say in the book, they had to be single and ride the subway. Basically, that was all you needed to do to make yourself a contestant of Miss Subways. And so as a kid, going to high school every morning, half asleep, I would be looking around for something to look at or read, and I'd see these, and they were always quite attractive women, and it was kind of just like, wow, Miss Subways, what a weird, who would really want to be Miss Subways?
It's an interesting question, yeah.
It's like, I don't know, so it was just so New York and so small in a great way that it always just stuck in. See, that stuck in my mind, and there was Joe DiMaggio doing Bowery Bank.
Yes.
And what I loved about that was it would say Joe DiMaggio, and it would have it in quotes. It would say, you get 7.5% at the Bowery. And I get it, they were telling you what your interest was going to be, but I just couldn't imagine that Joe DiMaggio actually came up with that on his own one day. It's like, don't quote me, but it's 7.5% at the Bowery. It's like, I love that it was in quotes. Joe DiMaggio says.
There is something very old advertising about that kind of expression. Yeah, that's funny. I almost feel like they could do the Miss Subways pageant now if it was open to anyone regardless of gender or orientation or age or anything.
Well, yes, and it did make a comeback, I think, in the early 2000s. But what is true and what is also interesting about Miss Subways was that they were open to women of color. And
that's interesting,
and to other nationalities besides, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans, and so many of them were Jews. It was not. It was way more inclusive before Miss America was ever going to be inclusive. So it does have that in its corner.
And I will throw one obligatory question about the X-Files, but related to this book. You said somewhere that working on that show for all those years actually did teach you a lot about story, which then you were applied to your writing career. What kinds of lessons did you draw from that?
Well, coming out of graduate school and, say studying a verse play.
Yeah. Where not story kind of secondary,
story-driven,
tertiary.
language-driven. Yeah. Or even, modern and 20th century novels.
Sure.
And postmodern, contemporary, whatever you want to call those movements. Not plot heavy, thought heavy, language heavy, surreal heavy. And that's really what I cut my teeth on. And that's what I thought was great writing. So I was like, plot, that's like so 19th century, that's so Dickens, that's so Eliot, who needs a plot? All I need is language. And I was wrong.
Most people really like plot, right?
They were human. We like stories. And as much as we like language, we like stories. And working on the X-Files and just kind of being in a plot-heavy, any kind of dramas, you better be plot-heavy, especially television. It is.
Yes.
It has to be plot-heavy. I'm going
to
watch my stories.
Yes.
I'm going to sit here and watch my stories. So I just kind of like ingested, and it kind of stripped away that, let's call it a pretension, but it stripped away that pretension of art for art's sake or language for language sake, or a novel is a language experiment, or some kind of Wittgensteinian conception of language. So like, F you, David, give us a fucking good story. So I was like, okay, well here's, I'm going to write stories and I'm going to bring my love of language into it for sure, but I'm going to make sure that I'm telling a story that's worthwhile and that people like turning the page, like I want to know what happens to those people. I'm interested.
Yes, that's a very, very important element.
Right.
Well, listen, I probably would have done an interview with you anyway, but I want to tell the viewing audience, frankly, I really did enjoy Miss Subways a lot, and I recommend it. I think it is really well written, and also I wanted to read it to find out what would happen to these people. So, so hey, there you go.
Well, that's perfect.
David Duchovny, TV and film star and author of the new novel Miss Subways. Thank you, David, so much.
Thank you. Pleasure.